Change of Mind, Change of Heart by Cassia and Siobhan. Chapter 1. Fights and Laughter. Aragorn was losing, and losing badly. Legolas spun around the young ranger and landed a light blow on the man's head. The impact was enough to split Aragorn's lip and knock him backwards for a fraction of a second. The elf danced around the human and sliced the air with the knife he held tightly in his hand, his wrist twisting the last possible second as he turned the blade towards himself and raked the spine of the knife up the side of Aragorn's cheek. Had it been a real fight, not just sparring, the blade would have cut deeply into the ranger, perhaps even to the point of mortally wounding him. Aragorn had had enough of being beaten yet again. He was tiring, and his leg was beginning to ache as well. The endurance of elves far outlasted that of men, and the human was very aware that he had reached his limitations. He remembered sparring with his two twin brothers, the sons of Elrond. The eldest of the twins, eldest by moments only, had taken him aside one day and secretly taught him how to fight elves. It was an ancient form of warring that had been banned from being taught. Only elves possessed the knowledge, and the use of it only worked against elves. Several pressure points could be taken advantage of and used in combat to incapacitate or kill an elven opponent. The implication of such knowledge falling into enemy hands had made it a deeply guarded secret. Hence the art of such war tactics had been restricted to the royal family only, and only for use in self-defense. The usage of such knowledge had long ago passed from being necessary. Elladan, however, knew the lineage of his mortal brother, and had a faint idea of the challenges that the human would face, so he taught the young man how to fell an elf without killing it. Aragorn had tried many times to perfect the technique on Elladan and Elrohir, much to their amusement. As things would have it, he had never been able to fell either one of them, and had only come partly close to attempting it on Moranwin, his closest friend in Rivendell. Parrying another blow from the elf and nearly losing his balance again, Aragorn figured he had nothing to lose. His dignity had already been stripped, and his energy was gone. He thrust his blade at the prince's head, ducked the arcing return of the elf's elbow, and spun quickly to Legolas's right side, coming up parallel with his sparring companion. The elf made to turn towards the man as Aragorn feinted a low sweep with his broadsword. As Legolas shifted his stance to catch the blow, Aragorn stepped towards him and smashed his forearm into the side of the elf's head, catching the prince with the ball of his fist just below the elf's ear, pressing against the soft, unprotected area behind his jaw. The elf's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed soundlessly to the forest floor, unconscious. Aragorn paused in utter surprise before letting out a wild whoop and shouting, "It worked! I did it! It really worked!" Legolas began to stir, and the ranger's battle instincts kicked back in. Aragorn quickly moved to stand over the fallen elf, his chest heaving from the exertion of simply bringing the nimble being down. With the tip of his sword, he just barely touched the soft underside of the elf's chin, dangerously brushing against Legolas's throat with each exhale of the man's breath. A cocky smile touched the human's eyes and slowly spread across his face. He licked the blood from the corner of his lips where he had taken the well-placed blow from the elf only a few minutes earlier. He couldn't believe the move had actually worked on the graceful elf prince. This daily sparring with his friend had been the highlight of his stay with the Mirkwood elves, and his victory in the mock battle had just topped it all off. Wait until he told Elladan what he'd done. Slowly he stood from his defensive position and stepped away from his companion as Legolas regained consciousness and tried to sit up. Lowering his sword, Aragorn reached his hand down towards Legolas to help the elf stand. His hand was quickly swatted away by the prince, who carefully stood from his prone position. His gray-blue eyes were dark and deadly, irritation at being bested by a human clouding them momentarily as the realization of what the ranger had done to him sunk in. Aragorn realized a minute later that he might have just made a mistake. Warily he took a step backwards as Legolas gained his feet. "Legolas?" Aragorn retreated another step, suddenly unsure as the woods around them erupted in elven laughter. Just perfect, thought Aragorn darkly as he realized that some of Legolas's friends had secretly been watching them. He was in trouble. "Very good move, human." Legolas dusted off his tunic, trying to block out the taunts from the other elves. "Who taught you that?" His voice was low and cool. He resisted the urge to rub the throbbing knot behind his jaw. What Aragorn had just done he should not have known how to do. Aragorn swallowed hard. Legolas hadn't called him human in that tone since their first meeting. Of course he remembered, now, when it was too late, the warnings that Eladon had given him about just how kindly elves looked upon having those tactics used against them. With his brothers in Moranwen it was all right, because they were prepared. They knew that he knew those moves. Besides, it had never actually worked before on any of them. The man's eyes were locked on the elves, and to the prince's delight, he saw touches of fear glint in their depths. He raised a fair eyebrow in question, and stepped towards the young man. Aragorn backpedaled, ignoring the snickers around them. "Where?" The question was repeated firmly. Legolas had just been humiliated in front of his friends and his peers, and he wanted an answer. "My brother—" The words squeaked out, and Aragorn's eyes shifted quickly about them, looking for a way of escape. "He said it was an area of weakness for an elf. I guess he was right, only it never worked before now." "Bested by a child, Legolas. You'll never live this down." A tall elf stepped from the shadows, looking between Aragorn and Legolas. "Quiet, Ranian." Legolas glared at the warrior. Aragorn chuckled in spite of himself and immediately realized his mistake. Legolas feinted at the ranger in mock threat, but the man turned and, with speed spurred on by fear, tore off through the woods. He had to get away until his friend calmed down a bit, or at least away from all the other elves, so he could formulate a sincere and humble apology without laughing mid-sentence. Legolas glared at the elf warrior nearest to him. "Well done," he growled as he watched the ranger's retreating form. His retort only served to amuse his fellow elves, and he ignored them as he nimbly leapt into the lower branches of the nearest tree in an attempt to chase down his friend. In minutes he had overtaken the fleeing man, leaping from tree branch to tree branch and running swiftly along their slender lengths. He passed up the human below him and dropped lightly down in front of Aragorn, blocking his escape path. The ranger skidded to a halt, his boots sliding on the pine needles and forest debris that littered the floor of the woods. His eyes were wide as he watched the elven prince rise from the crouched position he had assumed as he had jumped to the ground. "I didn't mean to." Aragorn froze. There was nowhere left to turn. "I really didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I really didn't think it would work." He had begun to fear that it had been a dirty fighting trick he had used on his new friend. He hadn't thought of it that way before, and now he was afraid that he had either hurt the prince or marked himself as an underhanded fighter, neither of which he wanted to do. Legolas reached over his shoulder and pulled one of his elven blades from his quiver. Aragorn dropped his sword to his side and stood perfectly still. There was no way he was fighting any more, and he'd never outrun his friend. The elf continued his advance until he stood mere inches from the man. The silver blade came up and touched Aragorn's neck, biting softly into the flesh. The man closed his eyes and flinched. Long strands of blonde hair brushed the ranger's face as he felt the warm exhale of Legolas's breath as the elf leaned forward and whispered into his ear so only Aragorn could hear him. "That was a very nice move. I'm proud of you." A smile split the serious fair face as Aragorn squinted at him out of one eye, cautiously venturing a glance at the prince. "Your brother was an excellent teacher, human." Legolas emphasized the taunt with a small laugh and lowered his blade. He stepped to the side of the young ranger and clapped him on the back. "I have never been bested so quickly or so efficiently, and never by a man." Aragorn watched with wide-eyed confusion as the elf began to laugh. "You're right. I will never live this down." "I will never understand elf humor. Never," Aragorn muttered as he sighed in relief, bending over and resting his hands on his knees as he tried to get his breath back. His leg ached deeply, and he massaged it lightly with his fingers. The muttered retort only caused the elf to laugh harder, and soon the young ranger found himself joining in. Legolas pressed his hands to the youth's back and turned him towards the palace. "Let's get back before they fear I really did do you some harm and come looking for us." He hooked his arm around the man's waist and allowed Aragorn to lean on him for support. "How's your leg?" Legolas asked as he helped the man limp down the path. "It hurts." "Good," replied the elf as he massaged the side of his head. The laughter of the two friends floated through the hollows on the afternoon breeze as they slowly headed home.